The story of Naomi and Ruth is one of the most profound narratives of divine providence, loyalty, pain, and redemption in the entire Bible. It is not just a historical account, it is a prophetic mirror that reflects how God moves in the lives of his people even when they cannot see him. Their story begins with famine, loss, grief, and confusion, yet it ends with restoration, breakthrough, and the birthing of a royal lineage that leads directly to Jesus Christ. What makes this story powerful is not merely the events that took place, but the God who orchestrated them in silence. Naomi represents the believer who has seen the storms of life, whose faith has been tested by bitter seasons. Ruth represents the believer whose loyalty, humility, and persistence provoke heaven's attention. Together, they reveal how God can take human suffering and weave it into a divine destiny. In Naomi and Ruth, we see that life can be unpredictable, but God is never uncertain. Loss is real, but so is God's plan of restoration. Sometimes God hides his provision inside people, places, and decisions we don't fully understand, and no matter how dark a season appears, God's redemptive power can rewrite any story. Their journey from Moab to Bethlehem is more than a relocation, it is a transition from sorrow to joy, from emptiness to fullness, from bitterness to blessings. Their story proves that when God steps into a broken life, the end of the story will always be better than the beginning. Before we dive into the life lessons, we must understand the spiritual significance of their story. Naomi's bitter season was not a sign of God's rejection. She lost her husband and sons, yet God was still working. Her emptiness became the stage for God's divine restoration. Many believers today misinterpret bitter seasons as abandonment, but Naomi shows us that pain is often the doorway to purpose. Ruth was God's hidden answer to Naomi's unseen prayers. Naomi expected nothing good from her future. Yet God planted Ruth beside her as a covenant partner. Sometimes God sends answers disguised as ordinary people, relationships, or opportunities. Their return to Bethlehem symbolized returning to the place of God's provision. Bethlehem means house of bread. Leaving Moab and returning to Bethlehem illustrates the power of returning to God's presence, God's will, and God's instruction. Restoration begins where obedience begins. God's plan was bigger than their pain. Neither Naomi nor Ruth could imagine that their suffering would become the foundation of the lineage of King David and the Messiah. This reminds believers that God does not waste pain, he transforms it. The 5 basic and important life lessons from the story of Naomi and Ruth are: 1. God works behind the scenes even in bitter seasons. Ruth 1 verses 20-21, Naomi said, "Call me Mara," meaning bitter. She interpreted her situation through the lens of pain, not prophecy. Yet while Naomi believed nothing good could come out of her situation, God had already positioned Ruth as the key to her restoration. God's silence is not God's absence. He may not change the situation immediately, but he is always aligning the right people, the right timing, and the right opportunities to bring you into his divine plan. Your bitter season is not a verdict, it is a process. The bitterness Naomi felt became the soil for her blessings. Likewise, many believers misread temporary pain as permanent destiny. But God is working in the background even when your emotions cannot detect him. 2. Covenant loyalty invites covenant blessings. Ruth 1 verses 16-17, Ruth's commitment to Naomi was not emotional, it was covenantal. In Hebrew culture, covenant loyalty is one of God's strongest attributes. Ruth showed godlike character when she said, "Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Where there is genuine covenant loyalty, God releases favor. Ruth's loyalty pulled her into God's prophetic agenda. She became a vessel in the messianic lineage because loyalty opened the door to destiny. Destiny relationships are not to be abandoned in difficult seasons. Honor, loyalty, and faithfulness can open doors that talent, education, or connections cannot open. 3. Purpose can be hidden in painful transitions. Ruth 2 verse 3, she happened to come to the field of Boaz. This was not coincidence, it was divine choreography. Naomi's painful decision to return home and Ruth's decision to follow her were both part of God's hidden blueprint. God uses transitions, relocations, losses, disappointments, unexpected changes to reposition his people for destiny. Painful transitions often lead to prophetic locations. Do not curse your transition season. The field you happen to come upon may be your Boaz field, your place of favor, recognition, restoration, and divine connection. 4. God rewards diligence and the humility to start small. Ruth 2 verses 7 and 17. Ruth began as a gleaner, doing the lowly work of picking leftover grains. But she did it with excellence, consistency, and humility. Destiny helpers are drawn to diligence. Boaz first noticed Ruth not because she was praying, but because she was working. Grace lifts you, but diligence positions you. Never despise small beginnings. The road to elevation often passes through fields of humble labor. What you do in the hidden place determines what God reveals in the open place. 5. God is the ultimate redeemer. No story is beyond restoration. Ruth 4 verses 13 to 17. Ruth marries Boaz. Naomi holds a grandson. The same woman who said, "God has made me bitter," now becomes the grandmother of royalty. The narrative ends with honor, joy, and restoration. God specializes in rewriting stories. He takes broken people and makes them carriers of divine destiny. He takes outsiders, like Ruth, and brings them into the covenant family. He takes emptiness and fills it with purpose. Your past cannot disqualify your future when God redeems. He restores beyond what was lost. Naomi and Ruth entered Bethlehem empty, but they ended overflowing with blessings. The story is a prophetic map for every believer who has faced loss, transitions, betrayal, or uncertainty. God is saying, "I am working even when you cannot trace me." Loyalty still activates favor. Transitions are part of my divine guidance. Humility will never go unrewarded. Your story is not over until I redeem it. God turned Naomi's bitterness into blessing and Ruth's obscurity into honor, and He can do the same for anyone who trusts His process.